Welcome back to another episode of the Open Source Cafe. And today we have Edward here with us. Edward, first of all, thanks a lot for joining. Would you like to tell our viewers a little bit more about yourself?
Absolutely. Kunal, first, thank you for having me join today. And everyone that's watching today, quite excited to be here with you all today. My name is Edward Ianel. I am part of Team Lens at Mirantis.com. And we are more than excited to be talking a little bit about Lens, the Kubernetes platform today. Kunal, thank you.
Thanks so much. And if you want to learn more about Lens, the technical sides of it, how to use, how to get started, various features, and heck, at all the hands-on part, I've already made a video on that. So make sure you check out the links in the description. It's extremely easy to get started, free to get started, and it's open source. But in this video, we're talking about something pretty fascinating. To 500,000 users, you have almost 500,000 users, right?
Yes, that is correct.
And
500,000 users currently leveraging Lens.
and when did it start?
Yeah, so Lens was dropped as an open source project back in March of 2020. And
Mhm.
shortly after then, Mirantis acquired the team behind Lens, which are all based in Finland.
That's amazing. So, what was like the motivation behind it? What are the problems that Lens is trying to solve, and how
Yeah,
has it evolved over the years?
absolutely, absolutely. So just to provide a little bit more context, Lens was known as Container initially, and it was a small startup based in Finland and slowly began to evolve. And the way it was really created and started, at least from my understanding and what the team has shared with me, is specifically around they worked with Kubernetes quite a lot and they understood there was tons of complexity and challenges when leveraging Kubernetes and really
Mhm.
around the multi-cluster management. So many of these organizations, people, individuals that leverage Kubernetes are generally working with more than one cluster, especially if it's in their day-to-day responsibilities. And currently, when we leverage these Kubernetes dashboards, you're generally only taking a look at one cluster or one certain type of distribution compared to being able to manage and monitor multiple Kubernetes clusters. So the team got together and had a very clear understanding that Kubernetes is complex. There's tons of different resources. They all live in different places. You need to leverage YAML. You need to leverage the command line on a continuous basis, and instead decided maybe a graphical user interface where Kubernetes users can view all of their resources in one beautiful place would be beneficial. So Lens started in that approach where it was a GUI that allowed our users to really understand everything within their Kubernetes cluster from a multi-cluster management standpoint. And then it began to grow and create its journey.
Absolutely. And I sort of got the hint of how you grew to 500,000 users, because when I first used it for the first time, I was hooked. So I was like, now I use it like daily. So yeah, I mean, can you touch a little bit more upon that? Like,
Yeah.
uh, how if someone wants to grow their product such a large scale, what are some of your experiences that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the biggest thing that I take a look at for small organizations or open source technologies or software that really want to scale is beginning to really understand what the value your product is bringing to you. And what I mean by that is you're not here to necessarily sell your product, you're here to solve a problem, right? And your users may have various different problems that they face. Generally speaking, when building an open source technology, I'm quite certain that the maintainers, the people that are driving this project, the people that are building this project are already experts in a specific field at hand. And for Lens, our team was quite experts at Kubernetes itself, right? So some of the things that we take a look at is, are we solving the challenges? Is it easy to use? And when we say easy to use, how is the onboarding process? How is the documentation? Can somebody leverage Lens even without documentation, right? And that is something that maybe even yourself experience or the community, you're able to leverage Lens, immediately understand that you need to add a kubeconfig file to that cluster, and it almost walks you through this beautiful display. So I look at it as in solving problems. Is it easy to use? And then one of the next biggest things we always took a look at was in product telemetry. So we wanted to be able to create usage patterns of how our users are leveraging Lens to dictate roadmap changes, right? So some of the things we would take a look at, and telemetry is able to be enabled or disabled all by the user. So I think that's important to note. But we would take a look at the journey that they were using Lens for. So really understanding, is it the multi-cluster management? Is it being able to understand how your cluster is performing in the last hour? Is it to be able to take a look at your logs? Or is it something along the lines of port forwarding into an application, deploying a Helm chart, and so forth? And really what we saw that was that Lens really fit this site reliability engineer's workflow, working with multiple Kubernetes clusters, reviewing your logs, troubleshooting, understanding the health of your cluster, your pods, your deployments, your daemon sets, and so forth, right? And then from there, we really took a community approach. And what I mean by that was every single question that came into our Slack channel, every single GitHub issue that was posted that had a true definition for us to understand what the problem was answered in real time. And we also
Mm.
had these Q&A sessions, Kunal, where the team would sit down with Slack members in real time and speak with them and troubleshoot with them. So we really leveraged the community to help us, one, guide our roadmap, but really ensure that we were providing the best product for these individuals.
Yeah, I really love your point regarding community-driven, development. And speaking of which, I have a follow-up question. Like, how do you? So this is often a question I get. How do we attract maintainers in our open source project? Like,
Absolutely, absolutely. And to be honest with you, Kunal, this is something that we also struggle with, even with being a
mm,
very large open source project currently. Finding the right maintainers are generally a troubling task, but we're very much interested in finding maintainers. And the best way to do it is definitely go to our Slack channel or our GitHub repository and either begin a message with one of the team Lens members in Slack, and we're more than willing to walk you through what we are looking for a maintainer. And then on GitHub, maybe you're able to already answer an issue that is posted, right? And then we'll be able to take a look at that, and we'll be able to filter, and we would reach out. And one of the things we actually did, and I forget the gentleman's name, but we hired somebody part of Team Lens that was a outsider maintainer. So they maintained the project, they worked on the project, and we actually hired this individual to come join Team Lens here at Mirantis. So that's the best route I would suggest, is one, obviously taking a look at our GitHub issues, reaching out to us in Slack. But of course, people want to be able to contribute to an open source project
mm,
outside of just necessarily being a maintainer. And some of the things that we look for is, again, being in that community Slack channel, answering questions. Maybe you can build a blog. Maybe you can update us on our documentation. Maybe you can point out bugs, issues, and so forth. And these are all things that we're generally asking the community to help us with. We are a
mm.
small team. Lens started with roughly 5 to 6, 7 people, and now we have grown to where it's roughly 15 different individuals working on Lens to a day-to-day basis. So the more community hands-on that we can leverage, the more people answering questions, the more people understanding the issues, the more people writing blogs, and really leveraging the value of the community itself helps us build an amazing product. So I just want to mention that the community really plays a huge role in the development of Lens.
Couldn't agree more. And speaking of community, you mentioned like the onboarding process. Um, what are the steps that you have made sure to take place when speaking of a great onboarding experience for newcomers?
Yeah, yeah. So is this referred to the product or the community itself, Kanal?
The product.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest things that we took a look at when building Lens was how easy is it to understand that what the end user needs to do is add a Kubernetes kubeconfig file to Lens, a desktop application. So in our previous versions of Lens, and I think it's important to start there, in our previous versions of Lens, when you launch Lens, it wasn't this necessarily extremely beautiful user interface. Instead, it was almost a menu or a guide mentioning that you need to add a kubeconfig file immediately, right? So we wanted to eliminate um, any form of friction when beginning to leverage a product like this. Because as we all understand, Kubernetes is complex. So what we did was, as soon as you open Lens, especially if you were an end user, this page would pop up, a menu page, really just asking you to add a kubeconfig file. So you almost had to take a shot in the dark and say, why am I going to add a kubeconfig file here? What's the value of that? But the reason we did this was, if we showcased anything else, the user would get quite confused of what the capabilities of Lens really is. So we just started with that beautiful landing page on our desktop application that mentioned to them that they would need to actually just add a YAML file. I do want to mention real quick, Kanal, and this is somewhat sidetracked, but when you add a kubeconfig file to Lens, we're always respecting your role-based access control from that kubeconfig file. So we're ensuring that whoever has access to that kubeconfig file has the correct RBAC on the file itself to be able to perform admin functions. I just think that's important to note whenever we're talking about adding a kubeconfig file to Lens and so forth.
I agree. And hearing from all these experiences, I believe it's not just one thing that leads to it. It's a collection of all the things like community and how much, like, starting with why. This was a TED talk I was watching recently, and it said that start with why. Why are you doing it? What's the reason behind it when
Yes.
building a product? Apple does the same thing. All right, cool.
Well, I do want to mention one thing there, Kunal. That
Yeah.
is exactly also what we did, right?
Hmm.
What is the why? And the
What
why
is the
is
why?
that it's also why, and the why is really going back to Kubernetes is extremely complex, and there were specific things that we wanted to make easier for our users. And one of those big main things is being able to understand all of the resources within your Kubernetes cluster in a graphical user interface while being able to ensure that they're working appropriately, that they're healthy, that the pods are running, or maybe the pods were terminated and so forth. So we always started with why, and that why to us was Kubernetes is challenging, and how do we eliminate that friction for new users and absolutely experts within the field.
Couldn't agree more. And it's always nice to see, when folks are focusing on the developer part of the dev and ops. So it's like, yeah, just making it easy for folks to get onboarded to Kubernetes. So I appreciate that. Cool. Let's Can you maybe tell us a little bit more about, like, briefly about, like, the features and how Lens helps in collaboration?
Sure, absolutely. I think something that would be interesting to do here, Kanal, since you also kind of talked about persona, is we can even break it down by features specific to a persona, right? Which I think is quite valuable to the community as well. So, as mentioned earlier in this conversation, we did talk about the site reliability engineer, the ability to monitor and manage multiple Kubernetes clusters. So, one of the neat features within Lens, and we just touched on this, is the ability to manage multiple Kubernetes clusters regardless of the distro. Meaning, if it is a certified Kubernetes distro, it will work on Lens. And how are you able to manage multiple Kubernetes clusters? Well, Lens is built with a smart terminal that automatically matches you to the correct context and endpoint of that Kubernetes cluster. Meaning, if I'm currently working with the K0S cluster, which is also built by Team Lens, it's a lightweight Kubernetes distro, and I switch over to a Mirantis Kubernetes engine cluster, Lens and the smart terminal will automatically connect to the cluster API endpoint, ensuring I'm working in the correct cluster. So what does that do for the SREs or anybody that's leveraging multiple Kubernetes clusters? One, they're ensuring they're working in the correct context, significantly going to reduce user error. But two, you're going to improve productivity when leveraging multiple Kubernetes clusters. Typically speaking, to switch from cluster to cluster within the command line, or if you're leveraging a Kubernetes dashboard, there's a ton of different kubectl that you have to write on command line and so forth to even ensure that you're working in the correct context that you envision. Lens is going to eliminate that friction and allow you to be ensured that you're working with that Kubernetes cluster. Now, we're also still talking about SREs, and some of these features obviously map over to developers and operators and DevOps engineers as well, but they have the ability to understand all of the pods, the resources, the daemon sets, the network policies, making sure that they're all running appropriately, and then having the ability to review the logs, download the logs, and even share access to a Kubernetes cluster with the colleague for them to troubleshoot as well. So from an SRE standpoint, it's the multi-cluster management, it's full situational awareness of everything that's happening within your Kubernetes cluster. Now,
And
if
you're
we
not like, no, no. I was just saying, first of all, shout out to that feature. I love it. I was able to switch between, like, Minikube and Sivo and other cloud providers and stuff
so many.
in an instant. The hotbar thing is extremely handy.
Yes,
And
yes.
I was saying something regarding, yeah, it's not like, if you're trying to provide that abstraction for folks who may not want to work with command line tools or YAML files, or it's like, if you do want to work, it's not like excluded. There's an option available for that. And I love how you can generate configs for various Kubernetes objects in just one single click and modify
Yes,
that. That's also
yes.
pretty neat. Just if you are wondering what it's like, check out my tutorial. I did that already.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more, Kunal. And that also kind of begins to speak to why developers and DevOps engineers are leveraging it. So many developers may not be the biggest fan of having to go learn kubectl, leverage YAML files, and so forth. Really, they want to focus on proprietary code that provides value to their business, organization, team, and so forth. So this is kind of brings us to the features for developers within Lens as well, which is that graphical user interface. So developers can get access to specific namespaces that may contain microservices within that namespace, and they'll be able to actually understand how their application is running, how the pods are running after that application is deployed to the cluster, and so forth. So from a developer standpoint, they're leveraging Lens towards the end of their workflow, right? Once the application or the microservice is pushed to a Kubernetes service, that's when the developer can actually leverage Lens to understand, oh, my container is running, or oh, my container was terminated after the application was pushed, or I need to review specific logs of a pod or a container for whatever instance they may be taking a look at. So for developers, it really eliminates the friction of having to learn kubectl, YAML files, and so forth. Instead, they have this beautiful graphical user interface that will tell them everything that they need to understand about the application that was deployed, how the Kubernetes service is running, and so forth. And one neat thing we are providing developers currently is the ability to leverage a dev cluster, which is really, really cool. So developers now have the ability to leverage a dev cluster for free directly from their machine hosted by Team Lens.
Awesome. And speaking of, leveraging the product, how is it helping enterprises? Can you maybe share some insights on that? Any case studies about, any
Yeah,
stories related to that?
sure, absolutely. So one of the things we can see, and I want to be transparent here, and we'll kind of take a step back. But one of the things we can see is, how many different Kubernetes clusters are being leveraged on a day-to-day basis, right? And that gives us a very clear understanding of how organizations are beginning to leverage Kubernetes, right? Whether they're using one production-grade cluster, two, three, four, five, or six. And generally speaking, when we've worked with organizations, spoken with organizations, because yes, Lens is an open source project, but there are centralized offerings on top of Lens. Generally speaking, we focus on being able to provide them services and support on top of their Lens instance. For example, speaking, um, we are able to stand up the entire organization with seats that allows them to be able to leverage Lens. They'll have support on top of Lens and so forth. But within the centralized offering, one of the newest things brought to Lens is called Lens Spaces. And Lens Spaces is a centralized offering. It's built for both enterprises and, of course, day-to-day users of Kubernetes. But long story short, what it provides is the ability to share access to a Kubernetes cluster securely without ever exposing the kubeconfig file to a colleague. So large enterprises that need to work with various different kubeconfig files and have teams that are working with different Kubernetes clusters can actually share access to that cluster securely through Lens Spaces without ever exposing the kubeconfig file to that colleague. So for example, Kunal, I can invite you directly to my Minikube cluster that's running on my local machine directly through Lens Spaces. And if I give you the correct role-based access control on that YAM, on that kubeconfig file, you'll be able to do anything you would like to my Minikube cluster that lives on my local machine. So that's something that's mainly built for large enterprises, but it's also built for our users who have colleagues, friends, and so forth that need troubleshooting or work together for whatever use case they may have.
That's amazing. And a third one that I'd like to mention is Lens is also great when learning Kubernetes. So you can
Yes,
focus on what it's doing and stuff. Obviously, like when you're learning K8s, there's an application-based approach and a theory-based approach. So having a basic understanding is fine. But after that, when you just want to get on the move of it, Lens can be
hmm
extremely handy. Speaking of, you mentioned it's an open source tool, and you mentioned your community driven engagements and everything. Can you maybe also share with the viewers how they can contribute, and
Sure.
maybe you can share the GitHub repository and some pointers.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Kunal. So one of the things I do want to mention to start out is we love to give back to our community in any capacity we can. So we like to do raffles, we like to do giveaways, and typically this is happening directly with our end users. And the way it's happening is either via Slack or Twitter. So before sharing how you can contribute, I do want to mention that if you are part of the Lens community, if you do contribute, if you do leverage Lens, we're continuously giving away some giveaways that we find valuable for the community, whether it be training courses, which none of us need because we have Canal here. Just throwing that out there. But we also have hoodies that we like to give away, PlayStations, gift cards, Amazon gift cards, various different items that we love to give away to the community and our contributors. So going back to the overall question, sorry for the small detour there. There's several different ways individuals can contribute, and I think I touched on many of these, but I think it's still important to note each and every single one of them. So the first way, which I think is the easiest way for somebody that may not be too technical, is just begin writing blogs. And you can either write blogs for Lens or you can write blogs for other open source technologies. But this really actually helps a small startup or open source technology significantly, because what we've seen within our community and the reason we've grown so much is specifically around organic growth. And what I mean by that is our users, our community is really doing the heavy lifting for us when they're sharing Lens with their colleagues, their friends, anybody that may be leveraging Kubernetes. So I go back to the point, which is if our community is writing blogs for us, they're contributing in such a big way that may not even be measured, specifically around brand awareness, helping new users leverage Lens, helping Lens current users leverage new features that they may not even be aware of, right? So one of the things I'm trying to drive right now is 20 cool features you can do with Lens, right? That many Lens users may not even be aware of. So the first one is definitely contribute by writing blogs or articles around Lens. The second one is coming to our Slack channel and answering questions. Many people that are new to Kubernetes or even just new to Lens have various different questions that they need help answering, whether they are really beginner related questions or complex Kubernetes questions, as well as how to secure your role-based access control. So Lens is really a community around, yes, we answer Lens related questions, but we also focus on the entire cloud native stack, right? Regardless if you're leveraging Lens or if you have a Kubernetes related question. So coming to our Slack channel and answering any questions is a great way to contribute. And then the third one, of course, is becoming a maintainer. And to become a maintainer, there's several steps that you would actually have to do. And I'm going to share my screen here. But there's several different steps you'll have to do to really catch the attention of Team Lens. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. But here we can immediately see Lens. And this is the Lens GitHub repository where we have over 17,000 different or 17,000 GitHub Stargazers. And then here we can see there's roughly 80 different contributors here. So coming here, you can immediately see all of the contributors, what the growth looks like, the total amount of commits, and so forth. But then on the left-hand panel here, we definitely have a navigation guide, which is going to really allow you to be able to understand how to contribute to Lens directly in the desktop application from the community standards, the commits, the network, the forks, and so forth. So this is a great place to start if you actually want to maintain and contribute directly to the open source project itself. And
Yeah.
then the next thing I want to mention real quick. Go
The
ahead,
link.
Kunal. Sorry.
Now, just saying the link is in the description, and make sure you give it a star as well, and check out the good first issues.
Make sure you give it a star and give it some GitHub issues. I'm stealing your line. Sorry, Kunal. But yes, exactly. And then come to our Slack channel and just ping me directly as well. If you're interested in becoming a maintainer and contributing directly to the open source technology, just ping me on Slack. I'll create some intros with the team, with our development team, and we'll go off to the races.
Amazing. Well, thanks a lot for sharing, and that was great. My last question is, what's next for Lens?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great question, Kanol. Even something that our team may not necessarily know. So we're continuously fixing and improving bugs and new features that we are bringing. I would want to mention that one of the biggest new features came to Lens just recently with Lens 5, and that has to do with our Lens Cloud offering, which is Lens Spaces and Dev Cluster. So Spaces we spoke about, sharing access securely to a Kubernetes cluster without ever exposing the kubeconfig file. This is truly revolutionizing within the space, within the industry, and so forth. Generally, when you have to access a kubeconfig file, that kubeconfig file is shared, and you have to leverage a VPN to access it. There's so many different hoops and so forth that you have to jump through from a security standpoint to ensure you're compliant with that kubeconfig file. And then the next feature that we just released with Lens 5.3 is the ability to deploy a development cluster directly to Lens, the desktop application, without having to write any commit or any code, kubectl, and so forth. Instead, you deploy a K0s cluster directly to your application, and you're able to leverage that. So I know I'm not necessarily answering what's new and or what's coming, but I do want to mention that just new improved features, tons of bug fixes, and we do have an announcement coming this week, I believe, which will be the release of Lens 5.4. Now, this release does not necessarily have any crazy cool new features, but we do have an auto wake and sleep functionality that is coming to that dev cluster, which means that your dev cluster can go to sleep and wake up based off of your usage of that cluster itself, which is something unique and different. So not too much to share there, but just a little bit.
Amazing. Well, thanks a lot for joining, Edward. And we'll be coming up with like some more initiatives, and check out the DevOps Bootcamp. More and more videos coming up on Kates and stuff. And yeah, just learn in public, have fun, and get involved in the communities. And it's going to be great. Check out the links in the description as a reminder. And once again, thanks, Edward, for joining. Really amazing, and congratulations on the huge growth. And hopefully, folks would learn a lot from the insights that you have shared. And yeah, share your learnings on like Twitter, tag us, and let us know what you learned from this podcast. And if you're using Lens, give us a shout. And if you have any feedback as well, happy to I'm sure the Lens team would love to know that. Join the Slack channel. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.